Welcome, everybody. My name's Andrew Kincaid from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I was told this morning to introduce Nicholas. It's my great pleasure. Nicholas Johnson is a scholar artist who works as assistant professor of drama and convenes the creative arts practice research theme at Trinity College, Dublin, my alma mater. And it was lovely last night with Nicholas to catch up on a few mutual acquaintances and friends over there. With Jonathan Heron from the University of Warwick, Nicholas directs the Samuel Beckett Laboratory and co-edited the special issue on performance for the Journal of Beckett Studies, 2014. Recent theater projects include Virtual Play, after Samuel Beckett, The David Fragments, after Bertolt Brecht, Beckett's first play, Cascando with Pan Pan, and Enemy of the Stars, after Wyndham Lewis. He co-founded the Trinity Center for Beckett Studies and the Samuel Beckett Summer School. He has held visiting appointments at Yale University and Freie Universität Berlin. Books forthcoming in 2019 include Experimental Beckett from Cambridge University Press, and a second book, Bertolt Brecht and the David Fragments, an interdisciplinary study that's been published by Bloomsbury. So it's a pleasure to welcome you all here, and thank you, David. Oh, thank you, David. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you also to Luz and Gunnari and all of the organizing team for a very stimulating and exciting few days here. So next year will mark the first 30 years of Samuel Beckett's posthumous legacy. And as gatherings like ours regularly, variously, and vigorously display, his literature is not yet gathering dust. Beckett's writing continues to find new readers, reach new audiences, and cross into new media. The complexity of his archival, philosophical, intermedial, and theatrical legacies continue to spawn new scholarship at a rate that few authors can match. This reflection for this guest talk, responding directly to the theme of transdisciplinary and plural Becketts that animates this conference, is seeking to take a long view of questions that might be at stake in the next 30 years of Beckett's reception, especially the opportunities and challenges arising from the set of technological transformations that we know under the rubric of digital culture. Already since the 1990s, we've seen readers, audiences, students, and scholars access Beckett's thought through means and media that did not exist in Beckett's lifetime, and even the technologies that did exist then have changed into something qualitatively different. What might we expect from the technologies that are only emerging now, and what might they come to mean to the Beckett of the future? In describing this situation and the difficult challenges that it poses for Beckett's legacy in particular, and perhaps, I confess, inspired by my own recent paternity, I have found it useful to consider Beckett's literature as a living thing to which he gave birth. The discourse of literature is increasingly laced with organic metaphors, and Beckett Studies is no different. Indeed, Beckett scholarship is one of the driving forces in the wider field of genetic criticism as a whole. The term epigenesis, invoked by Dirk van Hule and others to refer to the post-publication and post-presentation alterations that individual texts continue to undergo, is useful in capturing the dynamics of change that are at stake here. Biology also gives us the term phylogenesis to discuss the evolutionary development and diversification of a species or a group of organisms, helping us, I think, to group Beckett's living work today as evolving. That is to say, his texts form a living system inherently connected to their origins, but also adapting to new conditions in a framework of multiplicity and according to a logic of survival. There is also a paradox involved in thinking about Beckett giving birth to anything, given his narrator's intense anxieties around parturition, obsession with birth trauma, and broadly negative orientation toward children, to say the very least. A recurrent theme in Endgame is the denial of reproduction or regeneration of any kind, for any species, precisely to arrest the inevitable processes of evolution. Humanity might start from there all over again, says Ham of a flea. Of his own parents, Nag and Nell, Ham has nothing but invective to offer. Accursed progenitor, he calls his father. This is a layered accusation with biblical overtones from Genesis, of course, chapters 9 and 10. And because of the passively voiced accursed, the subject here is ambiguous. It could refer either to the speaker of the curse, Ham, as in I am cursing you, you are accursed, or some higher power that is cursing them all. What is clear is that in a Beckettian universe, a primal curse attaches to the act of giving birth. So in relating Beckett's writing to this act, it would follow that Beckett's writing is similarly cursed. These curses I've tried to demarcate as follows. First, born astride a grave. All writing is doomed to end. Writers fade, works are extinguished, and the last reader who knows or embodies Beckett's work will someday die. Second, a difficult birth. Writing is generally painful and difficult to create, for Beckett especially so doing justice to his writing, either editorially or directorially, is a challenge. And finally, the Gelenks lovely epigraph that we were speaking about on the bus today, optimum non nasci aut cito mori, to be born is to enter into suffering because of the machinery of desire. So it would be better not to have been born. Writing, if it is truly alive, is by its nature unruly, unwieldy, difficult to control. Writing that survives for a longer time, writer that enters the canon, is still harder, still more open to compromises and abuses. So I will go further to argue that Beckett's specific lineage, or family of works, is specifically cursed, condemned to more difficulty than usual, due to Beckett's unusual combination of talents and interests. Beckett exhibited prolific creativity in multiple media, and the stress of being saddled with an extreme care for detail is exacerbated the more prolific one is. His strategy of vaguening and his judicious use of silence, even his recurrent unwillingness to comment on meaning or interpretation, paradoxically leads to a profusion and proliferation of meanings and interpretations. Quoted endlessly about the need to keep genres distinct, including by me yesterday at this conference, Beckett collaborated repeatedly and fruitfully on intermedial translations of his work. Famously resistant to the trappings of fame, his insights have resonated to such an extent that he is viewed almost as a secular saint. The theoretically rigid rules around acceptable performance choices are unevenly enforced, with the result that festivals, programmers, and audiences can't seem to get their fill of remixing, restaging, and rethinking this work. In short, though prodigious effort was expended during and after Beckett's life to exert control over the work, containment of an oeuvre is always already impossible. Writing has an agency all its own. Again, I propose it is alive. It may stretch the metaphor to the breaking point, but perhaps Beckett was a bad parent to his writing. Limited communication, uneven rule enforcement, attempts at control followed by sporadic flashes of intolerance of his writing's hard-won independence. So if the basic idea of an organic paradigm for Beckett's literature is accepted, then it seems to me that this carries both political and practical significance for those who work in this field, either as practitioners or scholars. Namely, our role becomes the construction and maintenance of a healthy ecology in which the work can flourish, expand, and continue to self-actualize. I'm thinking here of autopoiesis from yesterday, the work self-actualizing, pushing the animating impulse of Beckett's work forward across boundaries and into new terrains. This is one of the motivations for establishing networks, conferences, research centers, and in my own case, the Samuel Beckett Laboratory, where spaces are designated and communities of practice are built that seek to address some of the questions that live within this work. And I won't go into detail here about the laboratory, but Jonathan Herron and I have disseminated this work before, and particularly this 2017 offer, it might be of interest to some people in drama education. Such practice is conducted not in a framework of commercial endeavor, with the pressures of the culture industry that this entails, but rather in terms of iterative, durational, and fundamental research and pedagogy. In the next section, I will trace some examples of projects that have responded specifically to the issues of relating Beckett's work intermediately or in light of contemporary technologies in order to establish a trajectory toward possible digital and virtual futures. Since my first approach to Beckett was as a performer and then a director in the live theater, I naively did not initially think of my own field of academic inquiry as essentially a technological one, or if technological, then reliant on ancient technologies rather than contemporary. However, writing a PhD dissertation on the performance of Samuel Beckett's prose quickly took me into intermedial terrain regarding the voice, recording, and broadcast, because any such inquiry requires assessing the history of Beckett's prose on radio, as well as combing Beckett's correspondence for his suggestions to Joseph Chaikin, Siobhan O'Casey, and others about using audio playback within stage adaptations of the prose. As I was doing this research in the mid-2000s, however, there was also technological change happening in the publishing industry, namely the fact that increasingly people were accessing literature through oral and recorded means other than the book, as in the hard copy book. The audiobook, relatively established by that point, was giving way to the podcast, and many readers were beginning to use tablets as well to read books on screens, which is phenomenologically different. At the time, I read this turn toward voiced prose as recalling both a specifically Irish oral tradition and a fundamental orality in the prose, following sort of two strands in Beckett's scholarship, Gontarski about the Shanahy, and Enoch Brader regarding the voice in the text, the drama in the text. Within the wider project of thinking through the relation between literature considered as an object versus literature considered as event, I developed an experimental setting in which to theorize this adaptation on the basis of a spectrum of fidelity to either audience or author in relation to the medium. So that's this project, which was kind of avant la lettre, a Beckett laboratory. We subtitled this the Beckett Laboratory. This was in December of 2007. So in Act 1, we had Not I, which was theater as theater, more or less, From an Abandoned Work, which was prose as theater. And then in the second half, or in the second act, we had, as we got closer toward an audience or contemporary fidelity away from the author, Dante and the Lobster, which was prose as performance rather than theater, perhaps, and multi-actor performance rather than solo, and Ghost Trio, finally, which was really teleplay as installation. So that's, this is the spectrum of fidelity from that experiment in the Beckett Theater. The outcome of this project initiated a few lines of thinking that have clearly informed my present view. The first two pieces revealed that even when the ethos is theoretically toward a faithful rendition of text, the specificities of the performers, designers, performance space, and the exigencies of the technical process leave a great deal open to choice, leading to both felicitous and infelicitous results. As is extensively demonstrated in the correspondence between Beckett and Schneider and others, and even in the projects where Beckett was his own director, live performance, the event of theater, rather than the object of the playtext, is always a site of instability and compromise. To direct a play, in other words, is always to translate a play, or adapt a play. I said adaptation then, I say translation now. Adaptations, again, in both an ecological and literary sense, are always required to survive and flourish in the environment of the live theater. In the second half of Disjecta, where I use some of the aesthetics of radio in staging Dante and the Lobster with a group of actors, and where Matthew Causey directed me as performer in a double-projected film of Ghost Trio, that's kind of fun. That's me in a different hair era. I find the grains of my interest in intermediality in the question of technological aesthetics. It turned out that by thinking about the audience in 2007 and what the audience might want to experience or understand in a theater event, we were all automatically thinking about technology. This aligned with the argument being made in Causey's own academic work at the time that the model of simulation, Jean Baudrillard's postmodern theory that the human subject has entered a realm where our reality is a kind of video hallucination, was now changing to a new model which Causey called embeddedness, in his 2006 work, Theater and Performance in Digital Culture. This is a postmodern integration of the human and the machine in which the distinction between screen and self is actually breaking down and each altering the other. So from simulation to embeddedness is the subtitle of that work. So there's clearly continuity from the 2007 iteration of Ghost Trio with Causey, with me performing, to our first professional collaboration in these same roles with Abstract Machines in 2010, which was a multi-year project in which we reworked the teleplays But the Clouds and Nacht und Träume for digital culture. Everett Frost has called these media-specific teleplays, or media-specific teleplays, but I noticed that the medium for which they were specific no longer exists in the same sense. The black and white television of the mid-1970s, broadcasting Beckett's small gray rooms to cathode ray boxes, often black and white, in other small gray rooms, has given way to vast high-definition LED flat screens and high-lumen projectors with content on demand. The cultural artifacts of Beckett's renditions of these teleplays with the BBC or SDR, while obviously beautiful and instructive works of art, fundamentally do not communicate the same relation between bodies and technologies today, changing a fundamental element of the universe of these plays and potentially their meaning for an audience. Frost cites the notable quote by Beckett on his seeing a BBC broadcast of Waiting for Godot, and this is in Nolson. Beckett says, "My play wasn't written for this box. It was written for small men locked in a big space, whereas they are too big for this place." And I would suggest we could extend this logic to the teleplays today. This project extends Beckett's argument to his teleplays, suggesting that they weren't written for our boxes either. Television has not been a stable enough category, practically speaking. Therefore, we felt that approaching these texts again in 2009 and 10 with the affordances of high-definition capture and projection, digitally precise editing of video, and advanced audio recording and playback would be instructive research that would expose something not only about Beckett's teleplays, but also about the techno-performative subject. Though in conceiving the project, we had initially thought that the recordings would be for a hybrid, live, performed installation. You may have seen that subtitle, Staging the Televisual Beckett. Including the live body of performer on stage as we had in Ghost Trio, the texts seemed oddly to resist this, and they were left as digital translations or iterations of Beckett's teleplays appropriate for screening at festivals or conferences, which they have done, but never commercially disseminated. The next stage of experimental work was consciously interdisciplinary. The first, a performance of 3 dialogues by Beckett and Georges Dutuit, grew over 3 iterations in 2011 in collaboration with a research center dedicated to Irish art history. The stages of this project ranged from an informal performative intervention in an art history conference through to a reading of the text staged as a formal debate at a part of a public humanities event, European Research Night, and ultimately to a fully staged, memorized, and designed theatrical piece at the Arts Technology Research Laboratory, which I directed but was also performing in as B. The final piece referenced developments in visual technologies, drawing on the pedagogical medium of art history, the analog slide projector, to display visuals of Masson, Matisse, Talcott, and Bram van Velde as they were under discussion, as well as using a contrasting live video projection of the Murphy chess game being played out during the dialogue by the actors portraying B and D. I don't have a still from that available, but this is one of the Van Velde pieces. This project was an important stage toward the Beckett Laboratory. It was 2 years before we founded that, as it began the practice of formally contributing academic record results from these experiments to disciplines beyond Beckett studies. So I was publishing in art history journals here. Shortly after this period, in collaboration with the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, we were invited to contribute a project on Beckett to tour to Bulgaria, Northern Ireland, and finally to the home of the President of Ireland as part of World Human Rights Day. And that generated this project. This programming invitation caused all the collaborators to consider the parts of Beckett's oeuvre that are most relevant to questions of politics and human rights. Seeking to make an argument that subjectivity and language as such are the roots of an authoritarianism and mass violence, we collected 4 plays under the title Ethica: Play, Come and Go, Catastrophe, and What Where, in that order. Like Disjecta before it, the sequencing, though apparently chronological, suggested a 2-act structure in which the concerns progress from the domestic sphere and interpersonal ethics toward the domain of state power and the cycle of torture. Ethica was also bracketed by 2 major questions about technology, which arose from the practical needs of technically staging these particular plays for the contemporary theater. Namely, what is the light in play today? And what is the mounted speaker in What Where? What is the V? Particularly after Beckett's own version of the film in which this is dispensed with. Seeking to balance Beckett's instructions, the performance histories, our current technological affordances, and the insights of our design team, we selected a visible but digitally controlled moving light placed on the floor in front of the audience as the interrogator of the actors in the urns in play. that looks like this. This is the Mac 250. It was the sustained engagement with directing play and the rehearsal methods we devised for this which had the greatest impact on the next and most significant stage of our technological experiments to date, which is the turn to virtual and augmented reality performance in the 2017 and 18 project, Intermedial Play, Virtual Play. So I'm not going to spend huge detail on this, but you can see a direct link with Intermedial Play when we used a camera to shift an audience that was distant from the room. So we still had play going on in one room while an audience was seeing on a screen with the surveillance tool the actors in the other. That was Intermedial Play. And then moving to the next project with vSense, which is studying virtual reality and digital content, we adapted play to virtual reality and now augmented reality. And we've extensively disseminated material on virtual play so far in computer science conferences and journals, as well as in Beckett studies. So I'm not going to spend time here going into this project descriptively or analytically. But I can show you maybe 3 quick slides that give you the summary. The first is about impact. On the one hand, on the left here, you see we're always asking the question of what is play. We're still asking what is play. We're just using performance and technology to get deeper. But there is this transdisciplinary issue going on at the same time, this large circle of mass technological change in which this is sort of sitting in an institutional context where this overlaps. So we see the impact of the project there. This is the timeline of a project like this. So it took about 2 years, really, to build, and different stages of dissemination and experimentation, recording, capture, processing, and then the dissemination phase, which is where we are now. And this is a list, maybe too small to see, but there's 5 publications so far, a couple of these in computer science conferences, ISMAR and SIGGRAPH, because of the technological innovations that were necessitated by doing play. So the computer scientists had an interesting research question, and then for us, speaking at Beckett conferences on Beckett and the media, Beckett and technology, and publishing in both fields, in technology and in Beckett studies writ large. So as I wind to a close here, I'd like to return to the animating question at the start of this paper, which relates to evolution and how we might connect in Beckett studies the language of biologists with the language of current theorists of digital and virtual technologies. So in one of these articles, the Contemporary Performance Review, intervention about virtual play, edited by Anna McMullen, who's here, my collaborator Neil O'Dwyer and I wrote the following about VR. Drawing on the theories of the posthuman from N. Catherine Hales and Rosi Braidotti, the evolution of this technology is the evolution of the human. Any attempt to oppose the two in a false binary is to misunderstand that each is the essence of the other. The human body is a technical body. However, the evolution of technology is now taking place at a mind-boggling speed, and it is continually accelerating. The overriding condition that characterizes these technosomatic evolutionary surges is that they force a renegotiation of rules, how we think and act, as well as how we make art. So this line of reasoning, as well as the term technosomatic, is indebted to the thinking of Bernard Stiegler, who is himself rereading the anthropology of thinkers like André Leroi-Gourhan, who argued for a non-human influence on genetic expression, in other words, the epigenetic layer. Stiegler innovates and develops this thought by introducing the term epiphylogenesis to discuss how human memory evolves somewhere between object and event, interior and exterior, deeply entwined with, in fact, inextricable from, the evolution of the technological tool. So the projects I've mentioned arise from the phase shift in mass media from analog to digital technology, exploring the implications for prose, radio, theater, and television after these media have undergone transformations that make them substantively different from the time Beckett was writing within them. To those scholars, practitioners, or copyright holders who expect that we continue to keep faith with Beckett's precise methods and specific directions, I think this dynamic and evolutionary model poses a meaningful challenge. The transition from analog to digital in the culture has now irrevocably altered the reception of Samuel Beckett. It goes beyond what I've argued before about the increasing instability and variation in the meaning of his works that specifically feature analog technologies as an integral part of the work. For example, Ghost Trio or Krapp's Last Tape that feature analog technologies. The recording and playback tools that merely signal a mild anachronism to today's generations may be utterly unrecognizable to future ones. The technologies and ecologies in which Beckett's work exists literally cannot be preserved from the ravages of time, and these difficulties are more likely to multiply than to disappear. Modes of receiving or thinking Beckett now exist, for example, on YouTube, on the internet, in virtual reality or augmented reality, or remixed in tandem with non-human algorithms or artificial intelligence that are genuinely new, either unavailable or unimagined at the time of the work's genesis, marking an evolutionary phase shift in the ecology of this work. The next phase of these changes that can be envisioned as an outgrowth of present trends in the next 30 years may be even more daunting, involving robotic or cyborg performers. How would we answer the question about gender with robotic or cyborg performers? The revolution cyborg performers, AI, directors or designers, or ever more embedded mobile technologies where we might experience the work. Even as AR and VR become more pervasive and universal means of exploring media content, game engines and the like, they will also alter and accelerate the ways in which scholarship around these areas is conducted. The revolution is already here in relation to digital humanities, and large database projects like the BDMP and Staging Beckett project show its potential, but still greater alterations of how we conduct scholarship are likely to arise from continued exploitation of deep learning algorithms, computer-assisted performance, and the expansion of virtual content systems. So my abstract promised a position paper regarding how to think about possible virtual Becketts going forward. So I will end this talk by articulating a position. If Beckett gave the world a set of texts, systems, and practices that changed the new media of his time, perhaps keeping faith with his avant-garde legacy entails performing disruption, allowing that the engine of evolution, the key to survival of the phylum, might be, in fact, mutation. I am told that good parenting involves giving one's offspring both roots and wings. If we are custodians or guardians of the raw youth known as the Beckett oeuvre, then perhaps we should be training that work for flexibility over rigidity, movement over stasis, openness to experimentation and tolerance of risk, resilience in the face of inevitable failures, and struggles. In short, an experimental and educative ethos can secure for Beckett a sustainable environment where there is still room to grow. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful. We have, I think, 10 minutes for questions and comments, so fire away. Do I see any hands up? Yes, Mr. Paddy.
Thanks, Nicholas. That was... Oh, I'm sorry. I'll take the mic slightly away from my mouth so you don't get that boom. That was a very, very good paper.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed listening to it. Just out of interest, and this is purely a speculative question.
Mm-hmm.
Beckett's work, and especially his work in performance and the various media performance, you can say is initially a representation of analog technology, but it's analog technology at the point of decay. You know, the tapes in Krapp's Last Tape are simultaneously treasured memories, but also junk.
Mm-hmm.
The music in radio plays is either in competition with the other voices that you hear, or is itself decaying.
Mm-hmm.
And right the way through the work, there's a sense that the material that is used to create the performance is itself eroding the performance. It's kind of like that, a tape which decays as it is played.
Yep.
How do you build decay into digital technology? Because at some point, this technology will decay. At some point, this will not be the shiny new thing.
Right.
This will be the old, tired, dying thing.
Well, it's a great question, David. Thank you. I think that decay is built in to the macro system, right? So this is what the literature and dust sort of epigraph is telling us. And the suggestion at the end that geological time will have a very harsh verdict on Beckett studies, right? When the sun explodes, we don't have to worry about this. So there's this kind of scalar post-human discourse that when we consider as part of it, even the digital technologies that are promising ever greater fidelity are seen to be ridiculous. And so that tension, I think, exists philosophically with the technology at the beginning, the idea that we could capture everything, get ever closer and refined. But at a very practical level, I had a wonderful fight with the programmers of virtual play, whose goal in life is to get ever better resolution into ever smaller packages and ever more communicable. They want the faces to be absolutely clear when they've captured it and built this digital model of the face in virtual play. Whereas for me, I kept saying, no, keep that static in, right? Keep the lines visible. Like, let's make sure that it's fading a little. It has to be a little decayed. They showed me an augmented reality football game on a table where I put on the HoloLens, and suddenly this game in Japan appeared. And my favorite figure was this edge misrendered referee who was just a couple pixels, recognizably human, but not there, not there. And that was my favorite part of the image. And the programmers couldn't make head or tail of this. So I think the artistic computer collaboration is quite important, that the artists can say, I know you want high res, but actually this needs to articulate itself. It has to have a grain or something ambiguous or something unfinished about it to communicate what we want. So being able to destroy the technology, as the early history of photography, we're just doing that same history of modernism again. Fidelity followed by distress and decay and diminishment, that has to also happen in the digital. That might require a different framework of rights as well, right? Yeah.
And we're going to go here, and then we're going to go over there. I have to do this.
Perhaps.
And I'm going to lose, but I don't care. And in a way, you answered, or at least pointed in the direction very nicely. And by the way, the presentation was absolutely remarkable in making clear what you're doing, and the amount of respect I have for it is very, very great indeed. And
thank you.
Can I come play? That kind of thing at one level. That's another question. But there are two things here that are not yet quite sorted out, and your remarks, in answer to the very, very good question before, prompted me to. This is my entree, okay? And that is that there is nothing other than an ideological reason why the technical devices cannot be used to make things look as much like the things that we are supposed to be going beyond. The choice that one needs to do that and have the kind of awful digital colors that are coming off with the rock videos and things like that applied to Beckett is a choice that people make for reasons that have nothing to do with the material, or to be kind of unhappy about it. There aren't any hoods in hooded figures or Ku Klux Klan men running around in Cascando the last time I looked, and putting that on a stage and giving somebody the idea it has to do with Samuel Beckett is not something that's going to win by affection, let's say. But there is one thing about finding new and interesting and delightful ways to do Beckett. And there are another way of using it to promote an ideological theory based on genetics and new technologies and so on and so on. The first time I met Mr. Beckett, before I was calling him Sam, I came in I had written him a long letter about what I wanted to, essentially what I wanted to do with All That Fall was to make what he wanted us to make. But I had a whole bunch of questions. This is a very long letter. But one of the things was I sat down and tried to point out to him that we now had multi-tracking. We had digital recording, not digital recording, but all kinds of things that you could do with Dolby noise reduction and so on, so that all that we could make Maddie Rooney walk into a real live landscape. And it looked like you had not put water on a geranium or something. He just kept getting limper and limper and said, and he never forbid, he said, well, that would be intolerable, but anything you want. And I couldn't figure out for the longest time what the problem was. The more we made her a bright, sprightly, lovely little thing that Billy Whitelaw could do very nicely, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as I've written, there was I won't go through it because I'm talking too long. There was a flash moment. I said, no, it's all inside her head. And of course, the world looks like that to her. And to make it look like when you're driving down in a contemporary cowboy movie or something like that, or a cop movie, is going to ruin it. That sometimes what you got to do is listen to the guy and back off of what the technology will do, and surrender yourself to what's inside the piece. And then from inside the piece, you can come up with all kinds of incredible things. But the idea that the piece has got to keep pace with the modern building technologies and all that kind of stuff is the place where you and I start disagreeing.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I mean, I think that the area of the question I'd like to enter is the question of whether we ascribe ideology to this. And I think that what I find useful in the scientific metaphors of laboratory or biology or genesis has to do with the fact that we are dispassionately observing that this work is coming into being in these technologies. It is growing organically from the environment, from the way that artists are positioning themselves, the way that those artists feel about Beckett, the way that they regard that as part of their heritage, the technologies that are available to them. And in a sense, like a child, we cannot prevent or control the coming together of these things. Beckett is in the culture, and these devices are in the culture, and makers are in the culture who want to put them together, and then they do, and then they get programmed internationally at festivals. So I'm trying to dispassionately stand back from that whole milieu and say, this is the type of evolution that's happening and growing and changing, and then say, what would that suggest when we try to read back to what is the work doing? So that little globe that says, what is play? That remains my question. You know, when I go into a virtual reality recording studio, I'm trying to know the play as deeply as possible, right? I first start performing it, then directing it in a theater, then directing it with a camera, asking that question, reading all the, Marin Karmit's performance, the Minghella adaptations, thinking through this history. But I'm living inside the text, even when I'm doing that. It's just that now someone is saying to me, how would a user experience this if they were going to experience it right here, instead of in a room there? And trying to answer that question in a way that balances medium and origin. So if there is an ideology, it is the ideology that we cannot stop this process of evolution of medium and content, and we could, if we were not willing to make some of those changes and sacrifices and enter the game of losses and gains of adaptation, then we would be saying in the future, when everyone has virtual reality at home, and they're downloading content and doing that, I'll tell you who will win: sports and pornography. They're going to win VR. So they're going to advance it the same way they advanced image compression, video, VCR recording, and television broadcast and the internet. Those innovations will flow from people's desires and entertainment. And I'm suggesting that maybe there's a place for Beckett's cultural contributions and his deep thoughts about humanity and identity in that form, in that medium. And that entails compromise. That entails changes of the rules. So,
we promised one more question, at least one. But I think we're starting to run out of time.
Hi, thanks very much, Nicholas. It was really, really interesting. I think my question probably does inhabit the same kind of area as both David and Everett, but I think it also responds to your response to David, and I'm particularly interested in the too few pixelated referee, because that points to something that I would be interested in exploring with you, which is, as you ended with a call for a certain number of terms, used a certain number of terms. I think flexibility perhaps was one of them, adaptability, I think, perhaps, yes. Survival, as things that we might want to foster for the Beckett oeuvre. I wondered, given the question of the turning to dust of digital technologies or the degradation of pixelated referees, whether there is a political project of some value in this context of, in fact, insisting on some values I might associate with at least some of Beckett's work of inflexibility, rigidity, maladaptation, and refusal to survive certain historically contingent conditions. And I think as you talk about the somewhat dystopian prospects against which such a politics might mobilize itself,
Yes.
VR, augmented reality, pornography, and sports, this seems maybe a pressing question.
Lovely. Yeah, I mean, I think we are in a cycle that I do not regard personally as sustainable, or the present mode of life. The transdisciplinary questions around our present mode of life do not strike me as sustainable. And so Beckett, I think, the root of everything I've ever done in these media is still the body, and bringing the work in a kind of kinesthetic way that we carry it, so that even if in a post-nuclear Holocaust environment, there are readers who are alive at the end of this, who contain grains of the thought of the material of Beckett, that is a mode of survival within that. And so a question, I think, one of the inspirations we had in the aesthetics that we were choosing for virtual play, we looked at a lot of Facebook pages of the dead. We were looking at how are people representing themselves in a post-death digital environment, and imagining the possibility that we might come to archive our lives or ourselves in a way that would preserve some of the consciousness or some of the ideas or ideals that are there. And immediately that becomes political. Who has access to which repositories of which fragments of consciousness in these new media? And so I think this is why the deeper metaphysical and philosophical questions that works like Beckett's could bring to technology are salient in that realm, as opposed to other writers. It's why I haven't sort of jumped at the chance to do Brecht in VR. I think that the questions around embodiment and consciousness and evanescence and disappearance and these resistances to medium that you're talking about, I think we can still ask those questions of this medium quite productively.
It might be nice just if you could do one more.
Sure, I'm happy.
Did you have your hand up? Yeah, great.
Gracias. Bueno, yo pensaba en lo curioso que es. ¿Tienes?
Creo que yo puedo entiendo, pero vámonos.
Exacto. Yo pienso en lo curioso que era Beckett, cómo jugó con toda la tecnología que él tenía a su disposición. No, yo no dudo ni por un momento que si Beckett estuviera vivo, estaría jugando, ¿no? También con la tecnología actual, que estaría haciendo tal vez alguna aplicación o realidad aumentada. ¿Quién sabe? ¿No? Pienso. Pero realmente quiero preguntar si en Internet podemos ver tu trabajo. O sea,
So I believe,
algún ejemplo.
Yeah, good question. I still believe that from the evidence of Beckett's relation with technology over his life, I think it's clear that he kept going to the newest thing when he was aware of it, and experimenting with that thing. So I believe that if he had survived to see the era of the internet, we would have Beckettian digital performance from Beckett. I think he would have been interested in this medium, in talking to people from so far away, multiplicity, avatars. These questions seem to me Beckettian questions. So I would not be afraid, I think, of engaging. I mean, it's a speculative question, I guess, as to what he would think. But I think I would not be ashamed to stand before him and say, this is the work. But I'd be more curious to say, what would you make of this when you put on a headset and you're in a different world? What would you like to make because of that? So I think Beckett can also serve as an inspiration for those of us who want to write for the medium new works and generate new material, and look at how he related to technology to think, how can we write a VR play that is the Waiting for Godot of VR? That's not Beckett, right? But we can use his to say, okay, there was this emblematic moment, a huge shift in the culture, after which someone generated a pivotal work for this medium that really ask the question of the medium in the way that The Unnameable asks the question of the novel, or the way that All That Fall or Words and Music asks the question of radio broadcast. I think that possibility is there for the medium by inspiration and looking at his legacy and understanding the work deeply. Mine, the virtual reality is previewed on the CTR contemporary, the review, Contemporary Theater Review has interventions, but there are links, and Trinity has some of these in the repository, but also people are free to reach out and talk to me if you'd like to get more access to links and broadcasts. Some of them are private because they're not licensed for public dissemination or commerce. They're licensed for research only. Okay. Thank you all.
Great, thank you everyone. Please join me with a round of applause.